You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C. On today's episode, we're going to take our sights back to South Asia and focus a little bit on the broader questions surrounding the China-India relationship, which is something, of course, we've come to on this show quite a bit over the last year, when especially we saw the biggest outburst of violence between the two countries along their disputed border. But today I'm very delighted to welcome onto the show an India-based analyst who's writing up and actually reading for some time on Sino-Indian relations. Joining me today is Manoj Kewalramani. He's a fellow in China studies at the Takshashila Institution in India. His research focuses on Chinese politics, foreign policy, and approaches to new technologies. Manoj, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks so much, Ankit. Glad to be here. Long-time listener, first-time speaking here.
Terrific. No, it's really a delight to include you. And actually, before we get into the discussion today, Manoj, I do want to highlight your Eye on China newsletter, which I've been a long-time subscriber to, and I find incredibly valuable to keep up to date on the China-India relationship, on China's activities more broadly in the South Asian neighborhood. I'd highly recommend it for anybody with a busy schedule that's looking for a one-stop shop to sort of pick up on all the details. But Manoj, why don't you tell us in your own words, what exactly you've been trying to do with this newsletter and what motivates you to produce it?
Right. So I think this began about 4 years ago, I think October 2017, just around the 19th Party Congress. And it began as an attempt to just provide, like you said, a one-stop center for anybody who wants to know what's going on in China, to just come here and get a glimpse of what all's happening. It's grown exponentially since then. If you see just the content of the newsletter, it's expanded quite significantly. And increasingly, what I've tried to do is that I've tried to look at more original Chinese resources, primary resources, to understand what's happening in the country and to try and bring that to light with a little bit of analysis for people in India and elsewhere, but also just focus on the India-China relationship and the different dynamics of it. Because often what happens is that in news commentary and news conversations in India, it's the more prickly issues, it's the boundary issue, which takes precedence, but we are not necessarily looking at how the Chinese are talking about India, how they view the relationship. So this is an attempt to try and bring all of those perspectives in one place. And from my point of view, it was something that I started doing on a weekly basis to expand my understanding of things. And then as I've done more of it, I've realized that it's not just a useful resource for me on a weekly basis, but also for a lot of people. But it began with a very selfish motive to try and expand my own understanding.
Right. No, I mean, definitely, I think, one of the things that I at least appreciate is your inclusion of, primary sources in the analysis that you do. I think that's quite rare, at least in my perception of the China watching community in India to some extent. So it's really great, that you're able to put this together. So I mean, you have noticed that interest in the relationship with China has grown in India over the past year or so. Is that fair to say with the pandemic and the border situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interest sort of picked up, particularly after Doklam in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
That changed the discourse in India, and I think that we have to think that it's the Chinese who've allowed that discourse to change, because the way Chinese media and Chinese official organs, whether it's the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, how they spoke about India during the Doklam crisis, that sort of started shifting perceptions, and it started hardening perceptions. And since then, sort of we've entered into high-profile events, right? There were these informal summits, and then, of course, now we've got the pandemic and we've got the tensions in Ladakh. So each year you've had something big as an event, which has focused public attention.
We're starting to get into the meat of the discussion here today about the shifting nature of this relationship between Asia's two largest countries and economies. So I wanted to ask you a little bit to just give us a little bit of the situation report right now about where the border situation between India and China stands. Because, I think I've done multiple episodes about this over the last year. We've had sort of very granular reports about, what's going on in the Galwan Valley and Depsang, at Gogra and Hot Springs. I'm not asking you to get into sort of the nitty gritty about the actual formations on the ground, but as an outsider, it seems to me that things are really at a standstill and have been for some time. India has made it clear to China that, it sees the relationship improving partly as a result of an improvement at the border, China doesn't seem to share that view. So just tell us a little bit about where things stand between the two right now.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of to me that's the big picture, right? I mean, it's about how each side views the boundary issue. From an Indian point of view, what's happened over the last year or so has been that 30 odd years of the sort of framework that allowed the relationship between the two sides to grow has been thrown away in a manner of speaking. And what we've seen is that the Chinese side essentially saying that, look, the boundary issue is one part of this larger relationship that we have, and you need to put it in that context. Whereas the Indian side is saying that, look, yeah, you can't have a normal relationship with such tensions in the boundary, particularly after last year where you've had loss of life on the boundary issue. So I think that that's to me that in terms of how they both approach it, that's at the heart of the problem. From an Indian perspective, I think the view is that Beijing views the boundary as a flashpoint that can be activated at any point of time to sort of exert pressure, political pressure on any Indian government that may be in power to coerce India. And from that perspective, and that's why you're seeing, and this is from an Indian point of view, that that Beijing is therefore unwilling to clarify basic things like share your perceptions of where your claims are, and how you would want to then sort of go about resolving some of these things. From Beijing's point of view, it views India's recent sort of infrastructure development along the boundary region as an escalation, as a shifting of status quo, and it's therefore sort of retaliating from its point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is not something that New Delhi buys at all. And given the sort of infrastructure development on the Chinese side, it's sort of it's rather hypocritical to say that what India is doing in terms of infrastructure on its side is changing the status quo to necessarily to sort of doing something that Beijing has not done.
Right.
So I think that's sort of the broader picture in terms of the two sides. Where things are right now is that in eastern Ladakh, where the tension sort of began last year, we've had 13 rounds of talks. We've had some disengagement where troops have stepped back from eyeball to eyeball confrontation in some areas, but there's been no de-escalation. Both sides have brought troops to forward positions, and they remain there. And the conversation is that if you need to go, you need to go back. You need to disengage entirely, and you need to go back. And neither side has been able to do that, and that's fundamentally because of trust issues. And from at least from what we understand, Beijing is unwilling to go back. And I can see why Beijing would be unwilling to go back, right? I mean, if you change the status quo in such a way, you need to at least achieve something strategically if you have to go back. To me, from a long-term point of view, when I look at what's happened, it's not just about the breakdown of trust, but even if you disengage tomorrow, let's assume that there's a 14th round of talks and you agree to disengage from all of the areas where you're engaged and you agree to pull back and you go back to sort of your barracks, you will still need to negotiate protocols for engagement in the future. How will those happen, particularly when infrastructure on both sides has brought you much more frequently into contact with each other, the PLA troops and the Indian troops? So you will need to renegotiate those protocols. You will need to rebuild trust. And all of that is a long-term phenomenon, which is something that both sides had invested in over the last 30 odd years after 1988. And that's what's broken down. So if you're going to rebuild all of that, it's going to be a long time consuming process, which is going to be fraught with risk. But I don't see there to be willingness from China to sort of do that at present. I think the current status quo suits China in some way.
Right.
It keeps India under pressure. It keeps India focused on the boundary as opposed to the maritime domain.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think the permanency of some of the changes that India's made, particularly with regard to its defense posture in the north, is quite notable too. We actually covered this on a recent episode of the podcast, looking at the Indian Army diverting the one corps away from the Pakistan border and the line of control towards the line of actual control with China. Some of these changes, I think, are going to be here for a while, and I think your point about just a longer term breakdown in trust, and at least the perception in India that 1988, 1993, the sort of status quo that was established, the long fought establishment of the line of actual control, for instance, some of those foundational understandings between the two sides have disintegrated over the last year. But zooming out a little further, comment a little bit, I mean, more generally on how at least India's strategic elites, and here I'd include everybody from senior officials in the Modi government, bureaucrats, defense bureaucrats, military leaders. How have their threat perceptions towards China shifted? I mean, India has never fully embraced the notion of China as an adversary. I mean, even with the shadow of 1962 hanging over things and the competitive relationship, really, I think, having been appreciated for some time. But, it seems to me that the adversarial nature of this relationship now has become a lot more apparent. So what is your view about how threat perceptions have changed? And actually, how has the pandemic affected things in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this has been a slow burn. I mean, if you look at when the Modi government first came to power in 2014, there was obviously a posture which was, publicly much tougher in that way. I mean, if you remember the late Indian Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj meeting with Wang Yi for the first time after the government came to power, and her comment was about, well, we respect the one China policy, but will you respect the one India policy? So there was that sort of public posture where you were going to take a tougher position. But there was also a lot of anticipation of Modi with the mandate that he had, Modi with the familiarity that he had with China, given that as Chief Minister of Gujarat, he'd visited the country and he'd done business there. There was a sense that you would see a much more pragmatic relationship. That over the years sort of fizzled out very quickly. And from an Indian point of view, what the perception was that there was a systematic attempt from Beijing to halt some way or put roadblocks in India's rise internationally, whether that was with regard to the issue of terrorism, with regard to Masood Azhar's listing, whether that was with regard to the nuclear suppliers group and sort of India's entry into the sort of nuclear protocols, and all of those sorts of things. So the sense was that there was a systematic effort from Beijing to stymie India's rise. And of course, at the same time, you saw much more intense engagement along the boundary. What happened in Ladakh last year is just one of a string of incidents which have taken place over the last 7-8 years, which have increased in intensity, increased in duration each time some of these things have happened. Mm-hmm. And of course, I think by the time we hit Doklam in 2017, and the Chinese media reaction after Doklam, and the Chinese official reaction by the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Ministry of Defense, and the fact that the People's Daily went back to publishing that September 1962 op-ed threatening war, all of those sort of had echoes in India of China being fundamentally an actor whose intent could not be trusted.
Right.
And I think that is something that I think from Beijing's point of view, there's a need for reflection in terms of how its own policies have sort of shaped the discourse in India. Mm-hmm. The pandemic, of course, by the time we got to the pandemic, you ended up seeing, and through the pandemic we've seen that there has been an immense sentiment which is very negative when it comes to in India. So whether it's with regard to the origins of the virus, whether it's with regard to Taiwan's participation in the WHO, whether it's with regard to, say, China's pandemic diplomacy, there's been a strong backlash in India. There's been strong sort of anger in India. And I think that sort of has, it's partly, a product of the nature of the relationship, which has sort of got much more competitive over the last 7-8 years, but it's also partly the sort of distrust which is settled in the public imagination. Because if you go back about 15 years ago, you had an Indian Prime Minister talking about turning Mumbai into Shanghai. So that, aspirational lens of, looking at China's development and looking at it as a model that you potentially would want to emulate, at least in terms of its success, that has given away to a completely adversarial perception. And I think a lot of it has to do with just how Chinese policies have changed over the last decade.
Right. Well, so you brought up, Beijing's perspective, and I think that's important. I mean, you've done a lot of writing on Xi Jinping's leadership tenure, and the role of ideology more broadly in Xi's China. So there's obviously one perspective in China that matters a little bit more than others. I think that's fair to say, which is, Xi Jinping. I mean, he has really consolidated a more personalistic style of leadership, especially in the post 19th Party Congress era, that I think has manifested in not only these tensions we're seeing in India, but more generally a muscular Chinese foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific more generally. So, let me ask you a little bit of an unfair question, which is, if you had to sort of speculate about, what Xi personally believes about the nature of the relationship that China has with India and about India's place in Asia, I mean, what would it be? I mean, clearly, I think we've seen a general sense that China sees India sort of bandwagoning with the Western bloc. I mean, we can talk about to what extent that's actually happening in practice, but those perceptions do seem to be driving some of China's behavior. But when it comes to Xi and relations with India, what's your sense of what he might think of all this?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer. I mean, if I look at what I read in terms of how Chinese media and how People's Daily and how Xi's speeches, how they sort of talk about the world, my sense is that increasingly the conversation is around the world being fundamentally adversarial, and the external environment fundamentally becoming far more difficult for China. My sense is that he views India as a specific regional problem as opposed to probably to much dismay of many Indian strategists. I think that from the Chinese point of view, the view of India is of a regional spoiler, possibly. And I think that's sort of also played out in terms of real policy from Beijing's point of view. And if you look at India's response to the launch of the Belt and Road in 2017, and its criticism of the Belt and Road, I think the sense was that India was a potential spoiler, and it was sort of playing that role. And subsequently, of course, it's hardened the view of India being an ally of the West, or a quasi-ally of the West, if not entirely an ally, and potentially sort of blocking China's expansion into Asia broadly. I think that is the sense that sort of prevails in terms of how we've seen Chinese policy, and probably that's the best sort of way to eventually look back at what thinking might be. The sense is that there is, if you can exert greater pressure, and India is vulnerable to certain kinds of political pressure, given its democratic nature, given the sort of fractured nature of the polity in some way, given social and economic issues that India faces. That if you can exert certain kinds of pressure, you may be able to get much more out of India. You may be able to get much more concessions out of India, whether that's with regard to Tibet, whether that's with regard to, say, other issues which the West may be wanting to push back on, but India will be far more reticent. And for example, if you just look at Xinjiang, India has issued no statement, no specific stance in Xinjiang, no specific stance on Hong Kong and the changes in Hong Kong. Even on the Taiwan issue, India has been largely silent. So the sense may be that India is susceptible to pressure, because it has certain pressure points that China can use, but it's not necessarily a strategic rival. It's a regional spoiler, which needs to be coerced, cajoled, pressured, that you can contain, and you can sort of shape its preferences and choices. Right. My sense is that's how Beijing views India.
Yeah, no, and I think some analysts have called the relationship a one-sided rivalry, just in terms of at least the perception and the mind space that India takes up in China versus the mind space that China takes up in India more generally. And I think what you're describing is somewhat similar. Let's dig in a little bit on the Taiwan question. Right, you briefly mentioned it, and you're absolutely right that India does keep a low profile, obviously under, India has its own one China policy, official ties with Beijing, a vibrant economic and unofficial relationship with Taiwan, of course. But one of the most interesting dynamics, at least for me, I mean, watching this from the outside and sort of reading the Indian media and the commentary in India on Taiwan, it's just been interesting to see the level of energetic support for Taipei among Indian civil society, the press, to the extent where I believe the Chinese spokesperson at the embassy in New Delhi, released a statement asking the Indian media to respect the Indian government's policy towards Taiwan and China more generally. So, what's your sense of continuity and change, I guess, in the India-Taiwan relationship? Taiwan is becoming a more of a hot button issue. The Biden administration, in particular, is raising Taiwan more frequently with allies and partners, encouraging them to become more outspoken, attempting to multilateralize the Taiwan problem in general. So, do you think New Delhi is likely to seriously think about any changes to its Taiwan policy? I'm not talking, of course, about anything like formal recognition, but short of that, trying to push China's buttons, so to speak, on this issue.
Yeah, I think we've seen that happen. I think we've seen New Delhi be a little bit more vocal when it comes to this, although it's not, there haven't been sort of statements issued, and most importantly, in terms of the Quad Summit, we didn't see Taiwan be part of that statement. But I think that there's been far greater discourse in India. There's been far greater conversation about engaging Taiwan. There's been far greater talk about exchange of students, technology, and that being a critical sort of center of trade between the two countries. The possibility of increased Taiwanese investments in India. So there's been a lot more conversation around Taiwan than you probably noticed 2 years ago. And the pandemic has sort of galvanized some of this conversation around Taiwan. At the same time, what we've seen is that New Delhi has generally been much more quiet, whereas the media discourse has been much more active. But if you just look back at sort of economic engagement with Taiwan and even sort of people-to-people engagement over the years, there's been a gradual increase. For many, it's not been satisfactory, but there has been an increase. Our trade today is it about $5 billion, a little bit more than $5 billion. There are about 2,000 Indian students studying in Taiwan. There is more sort of exchange in terms of fellowships. There's greater talk about language learning and the possibility of more of that happening. So I think that there is a much more serious approach towards engaging Taiwan that's taking place. That sort of the conversation around that is taking place in India. But there is caution with regard to what sort of utterances you make in the public domain, particularly at international forums, and how you sort of approach that issue. And an example of this is that last year India was the chair of the WHA, but we didn't see anything specific with regard to Taiwan. We didn't see sort of any efforts to ruffle any feathers and things like that. So I think that there is officially caution, but still there is greater engagement. Yet in the public discourse in India, I mean, if you just observe the media, what you will see is that there is tremendous support for Taiwan. I mean, every year for the last couple of years, we've seen on National Day in Taiwan, we've seen posters being put up in Delhi, congratulating Taiwan and supporting Taiwan. We've seen far more sort of engagement from even Indian politicians from the ruling BJP who've congratulated Taiwan and who've sort of engaged with politicians from Taiwan. So I think that you've seen a little bit more sort of adventurism, if I could put it that way, but it's still extremely cautious. And I think that caution will remain. The last sort of point that I wanted to make on this is that I think this is still a conversation that's brewing in India. There is a much more, there is a much more serious discussion to have about what India's opportunities and what are the costs and opportunities of changes in status quo along Taiwan Strait, and how does that impact India's interests, given how the situation there could unfold. And I think that's a conversation that the Indian system and the Indian strategic affairs community and the Indian government needs to have with much more seriousness, because we are moving into much more tricky times,
Right.
particularly not just with regard to what the PLA is doing, but also with regard to the domestic dynamic in Taiwan, in terms of the discourse around, the current administration and the possibility of the next election leading to something else.
Right.
So I think we need to have that conversation much more seriously in India.
No, thanks, Manoj. That was a really fascinating overview. Very nuanced. You actually don't see a lot, at least here in Washington, and I think even elsewhere in Asia, on the perspective that New Delhi has towards the Taiwan question. So thanks for that great overview. Before we wrap up today, I just wanted to generally sort of get your reflections on the state of China watching in India. I know it's a small community, and as you highlighted at the beginning of our discussion today, interest in China has gone up quite a bit in India for reasons we've already discussed. But I just wanted to get a sense of how you see this this community in India developing. What level of expertise you think is actually informing Indian policy in practice, and where India could do better in terms of understanding China. There's I think a divide on both sides in terms of China's understanding of India and India's understanding of China. But my sense is that the community in India that seeks to understand China is in many ways a lot more developed. But I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think I'd sort of begin with just media, and my sense is that we need much more of Indian media focused on covering China from China. And we've had very little of that. There is a handful of journalists, even fewer than a handful of journalists, Indian journalists who are in China. So a lot of Indian discourse on China is informed by Western reporting, or actually, yeah, Western reporting. It's not even necessarily Chinese media reporting, which is another grouse that I have with our media, is that we don't necessarily look at primary sources. We don't necessarily look at how the Chinese administration, how the Communist Party, how the system is sort of engaging with itself and talking to itself. A lot of this is second-hand, third-hand data that we're using, and I think that's flawed. So, but that's the media level, and that's the public discourse level. A lot of what you hear is a repetition of established sort of stereotypes and lines that you may hold. The second thing is in terms of the strategic affairs community, and I think here, I mean, I might be biased in saying this, but there's an expansion in capacity that you can see over the last 4 or 5 years. There are many more people who are much more seriously engaged in trying to understand different dimensions of what's happening in China, what's happening with the PLA, and all of that. And I think that's a positive, because it's much more information that's going into the system to think and to deliberate in terms of how to approach Beijing. So to me, that the strategic affairs community discourse has become much more robust than it was in the last 4 or 5 years, and I see this becoming much more robust down the road, given the sort of adversarial nature of the relationship that we're seeing developing. At the same time, there is actually quite an interest to develop, the other sort of dimensions of this relationship, because it need not just be your neighbors. You're going to coexist with each other one way or the other. It need not just be an adversarial relationship. So there is sufficient groundwork that is being laid in different forums to try and engage much more deeply on issues like, say, urbanization, pollution, the environment, and things like that. And I think we've got the groundwork there. It's just the challenge is that, the sort of fundamental aspects of the relationship are out of whack at the moment. So I think that's also a sign that should stay. So the moment things fall into place, you can see actually things get better. At the same time, there is clearly an economic relationship which is important, which is significant, and we've seen that grow. Right, our trade today this year will hit $100 billion. Mm-hmm. Which is the highest it has ever. So you can see that there is tremendous economic opportunity on both ends. And again, it depends on how the sort of boundary issue in that plays out. The last thing that I would say is what we're seeing is that, and this is a positive sign again, is that we're seeing government engage far more with folks from outside government. The MEA, the Indian External Affairs Ministry, formally picks up consultants. It's formally engaging with far more groups. If you look at the MEA's outreach to different think tanks in its budget, it's funding far more discussion, far more conversation around issues that are important, particularly around China. So there is an effort to sort of engage with the think tank ecosystem, which is still very, very new in India. But you're seeing that there's a far greater effort to do that. So to me, those signs are sort of positive. The one thing that I wish that we did more of is that we looked far more deeply at primary sources, because there's a lot of information that Beijing puts out which we don't look at. And our effort at Takshashila has been to try and do more of that.
Right. Yeah. Open source analysis in Chinese, I think, is also necessary here in the United States. There's been a big call to facilitate greater, at least government-backed funding of open source resources more generally, as for instance the United States did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But Manoj, I really want to welcome you, or thank you rather, for joining me on the show today. Really benefited from listening to your insights. Once again, for our listeners, Manoj writes the excellent Eye on China newsletter. I'd highly recommend it if you're interested in keeping up on the China-India relationship and China's activities in South Asia more generally. But Manoj, once again, thank you for joining me, and I hope to have you back on soon.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Pleasure.
For listeners, if you liked what you heard on the podcast and you'd like to keep up with future episodes, make sure you subscribe. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you really get your shows. We're there. And secondly, if you've been subscribed for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. It really helps get the word out there about the show, and we do appreciate it. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.